Welcome to Beyond the Valley, a CNBC tech podcast with Arjun Kharpal and Tom Chitty.
Beyond the Valley.
The World Economic Forum released a report earlier this year which estimated that the global space economy will treble to $1.8 trillion by 2035. Not only will it rival the size and reach of the semiconductor industry, but space technologies will become as widespread as microchips are today. And so, the 21st century space race has taken off, led in large part by private companies. But, as we'll find out, the major superpowers have space ambitions of their own.
Beyond the Valley.
So for this week's episode, we're going to start things off a little differently. We do have a special guest, but before we get to them, Arjun wants to do a little scene setter for you.
Yeah, that's right, Tom. Look, I just want to set the scene because, space has been this sort of area that governments have been aiming to take a lead on for many, many decades at this point and dominate. And of course, the US, as we know, has been a very prominent space power for a very long time. But we're now getting into an era where we're seeing China flex its muscles in space, and India as well, which we'll obviously talk about. But I just want to tell a very small story to set the scene. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, which sparked this space race between it and the US. China, however, was nowhere really to be seen. While the US and the Soviet Union were battling for superiority in this new domain, Mao Zedong, one of the founders of the Chinese Communist Party, reportedly said at the time, China cannot even put a potato in space. Right. Since Mao's comments, China has launched satellites, sent humans to space, and is now planning to build a base on Mars. China has its own rival to America's GPS called Beidou. A Chinese spacecraft has also landed on the far side of the moon to collect samples, and China wants to send its first crewed mission to Mars in 2033. So, a lot of things have changed now. Perhaps at one point it was the Soviet Union as one of the big space powers. Now it's China. And that's all going to, I think, set the scene for the discussion we're about to have.
Fantastic. That does set the scene. Let's then introduce our special guest for this episode. Professor Chris Newman is Professor of Space Law and Policy at Northumbria University Law School. He is actively engaged in research in the emerging field of space law and has been recognised as a national expert on UK and European space law and policy. Chris, thank you for joining Beyond the Valley.
No problem at all. Lovely to be here.
Chris, just wanted to first ask you, have you always been a space nut?
Yeah. I'm afraid I have. There's no way of hiding it. There's no way of wrapping it up. I'd love to tell you that I'm some sort of analytical, expert in it. What you're talking to is an 8-year-old boy who got lucky. I love space. I've always loved it. I've always loved the exploration. I've always loved the personal stories. I've loved the great power element behind it. I've loved the tech. And increasingly, as my legal career developed, I started applying those questions that, lawyers apply to everyday activities. I started thinking about this in terms of space. And what I found was actually there was this great body of work that's already been going on. There's some real great lawyers who've asked themselves questions about what is law going to be like going forward. And I think it's really interesting that we're now in a time, and I think you're exactly right, space law is in a position where I think cyber law was about 20 years ago. I think we're really starting to see it get operationalized and come to life.
Fantastic. And you were mentioning before we went to press record that you wanted to probably be an astronaut maybe at one point, but your maths wasn't quite up to scratch. Is that?
I should say I've never wanted to be an astronaut. I'm too cowardly and too overweight. You'd need to develop a whole new lifting technology to get me into orbit. But I have always wanted to be part of the space program, reading books about life in mission control. There is a brilliant book by it's by one of the flight controllers, and talks about the evolution of flight control. And I've always wanted to do that. It's by Eugene Kranz, the flight controller from Apollo 13, and that was what I wanted to do. I'm too scared to even go up the elevator up to the Apollo rocket.
Well, Chris, we were going to get into the cultural stuff at the end of the episode, but I like that you've already put in a little book recommendation early on. Let's get into the game show part of the podcast, and we'll play Stat of the Week. I know you, Chris, you know Stat of the Week, so Arjun, give it to us.
That's right. So you gave a nice stat yourself at the start, which was good. But my stat is 100,000 years.
100,000 years. So I like to make a note, Chris, but
Yes.
just to remind myself. But you don't. I mean, you may remember that better than me. 100,000 years, fantastic. Before you give us some background, Chris, on what we're talking about today, explain this. Can we say almost obsession with space? I mean, a place most of us will never visit, and from down here on Earth seems to have very little bearing on our lives. Why this obsession?
I think there's a number of dimensions to this. I think the modernity of it is one of the things. The fact is, it really speaks to human progress. The moon, for example, has played such a large part in humanity's stories going back 20, 30,000 years. People have looked up at the moon. People have worshipped the moon. People have fallen in love under the moon. People have used the moon for all sorts of things. So it's a real symbol of sort of attaining these things that humans once thought were mythical and are now very practical and rudimentary elements of our lives. So I think there's the modernity aspect of it. I think for me personally, there's a sense of wonder about it all. There's a sense of seeing, seeing us in our true place within the universe. I think there's something really magical and that really appeals to me about that. And I also think there's something about the tech side of things, the actual getting there. It's a real technological journey. So I think you've got these three areas which all combine to make perfect stories, and it's stories that people want to hear. So I think you've got, you look at the Apollo story, you look at the story of Yuri Gagarin, you look at the development of the space station. All of these are stories that add these elements of modernity, these elements of technology, these elements of magic and mythology. And so it's really easy to fall in love with space, or at least it's been really easy for me to fall in love with space.
And in terms of, you mentioned the tech. What about the science as well? Because many people will go, there's all these massive, very expensive missions to space. Why does it affect life on Earth?
And I mean, that's a legitimate question. I think there's, again, two ways to look at this. The first way to look at it is the spin-off technology. The developments that we've seen from the Apollo program in terms of terrestrial applications, the development that we've seen in terms of medicine, from long duration occupation of outer space on space stations. So I think there's spin-off technology, but I also think there's a sense of, again, finding out our place in the universe. There's a lot of science that doesn't have commercial or, retail implications, but we're just finding things out to make us better. And I think there's a lot to be said for that.
And beyond the wonder, beyond the science, beyond the tech, space has always been political in many realms. It's become nowadays a battle between the US and China. It was once a battle between the US and the Soviet Union. Is there a new space race on right now? What does that mean? What does that look like? And why has it been so ingrained in sort of political tensions and battles between nations?
I think it's a bit more nuanced than a race. I would say that yes, there is a race element, but I think that's sort of self-generated because people need something to work towards. I would suggest that, any race to the moon is over. The United States got there. They did it. So what we're looking at now is perhaps a second space age, where we're looking to use space as real sort of citizens of outer space. We're looking to develop our presence there. So I think what we have is a move away from a race narrative into, an actual spacefaring civilization and looking to develop that. But as you rightly say, at the minute, what we cannot do is cast off the great power, the big power competition on this, because space is still a manifestation of foreign policy. It's still a manifestation of terrestrial ambitions and terrestrial militarization. So I think I'd move away from the race narrative. I'd move away to the space age. But I think we are entering a different age of activity here. I think we're moving from the wow, we can get there to, okay, what can we do there?
And when you talk about space power, how do we measure that? What does that involve? And I suppose where do the private companies fit in?
There are, again, we talk about books, there are books written on measuring space power and identifying space power. It's not something that I'm going to claim any expertise on, but what I am going to say to you is this is an area where we can look and we can see the real development in space activity. So we start with who are the nations leading space, and it's obvious America's there. They're the ones doing it. They're the ones launching. They're the ones with the private industry infrastructure that feeds into the national space agencies and feeds into their national activity. So I think on the one side you can look and you can say, well, who's doing it? Who's actually doing it? And I think China, the discussion on China at the top was absolutely apposite, because China's really interesting. China has moved from, as you say, from a standing start right the way through to human spaceflight, to a space station. It's got a space station in orbit as we speak. It's got a very, very well planned and very well delivered lunar exploration program. So I think China is obviously a significant player. I think from a commercial perspective, we've got a number of countries, India being I would suggest one of the leaders in this, looking to really capitalize on space program as a way of generating revenue for their economy, getting the best value for money out of space, if you like. And then you've got a number of other nations, and I'm including the UK, I'm including Australia, New Zealand in this, all of whom are looking to develop the space economy as well. So I think, again, the picture is not straightforward, and it very much depends on the brand of geography you look at.
We'll get on to sort of China and India in a moment, but I wanted to pick up on something you said, Chris, and that was around it's gone beyond, yes, we can get there, to now becoming citizens of space. You've got people like Elon Musk, for example, the CEO of Tesla, the founder of SpaceX, saying he wants to, create these colonies on Mars, and we need to look beyond Earth as a place to live. When we look at some of the more recent launches and projects, it's things like China getting sort of samples from the far side of the moon, and India looking at the South Pole of the moon. And when you look at the next sort of space age, what are some of the key things that are going to be happening beyond just say we're going to get to the moon?
So I've got one word for you that I think sums up everything that we need: infrastructure. If you look at the Apollo missions, each Apollo mission was a separate individual mission. They effectively back to square one. So Apollo 11 got to the moon. Okay, Apollo 12. It was a fresh mission. The risks were the same. The dangers were the same because it was a brand new mission. I think what we need to look at now is making space more accessible in terms of, okay, well, they're getting up there. Once we get up there, what about the communications? What about living there? What about the transit back and forth? So I think it's all about putting infrastructure in place to make human accessibility to space more, if you like, mundane.
You touched on it earlier about the US is at the forefront of space exploration, is probably still seen as the major space power. But has that gap closed between them and the rest over the last few years, or are they still very dominant?
I think they're still the dominant player. If you're thinking about space activity, if you want to get involved in outer space, if you want to get involved in exploration, if you want to get involved in commercial activity, you're looking to America. You're looking to collaborate with Americans. You may be part of a consortium, part of an international consortium, but you'll be looking over to America. And that's not to say that there aren't some really ambitious projects going on in the European Space Agency, in ISRO, and in others. But I think America is it's the go-to place, I would suggest.
And let's then touch upon China, Chris, as well, because I sort of mentioned some of the more recent achievements that the Chinese have managed to get to. How do you assess sort of China's development right now from, that reported anecdote I told about Mao saying they couldn't put a potato up in space?
I think China's a fascinating case study because I think space is part of their foreign policy toolkit. That's the way I think that China uses space. It uses it, and again, we talked about the Baidu GPS constellation. We talked about the lunar exploration program. They've got a really advanced mission that they're developing in terms of sample return. Sample return's really difficult to do, and yet they're managing to successfully engage in that. So I think what we've got is, in terms of China, we've got a whole space ecosystem being built up within their broader foreign policy, as I say, toolkit. So they're using space as part of that. If you look at the developments in AI that are coming out of China and quantum computing that's coming out of China, and the development of their commercial space sector, it's something that's not really talked about. But China not only has a very, a large space sector in public ownership, but also it's developing private sector firms as well and private launch capacity. It's developing private satellite manufacturing. So that's something that I would keep an eye on, because I think they're going to develop, and they're looking to develop access to space in the way that America's private sector has done as well. It's not just America where the private sector activity is happening. China has a vibrant private space industry, and I think that's something to keep an eye on over the next 10 years.
Yeah, and Tom sort of alluded to that as well, the private side of the equation. That's been a huge change, hasn't it, over the past sort of 10 years or so, where it was once space was only in the realm of national governments. And all of a sudden you've got companies like SpaceX, which have become such a dominant player in terms of launches. It's a private company being able to do that. That's been a big change in the US. We're seeing bits of it here in the UK as well. And you said that's happening in China now as well.
Yes, it's happening all over the world. There are these private companies looking to develop their capacity and looking to get a piece of the space economy pie.
Just because it's lucrative.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, is that the future then? Like this balance between a state sort of national space agency and the private sector supporting that, just because it makes sense financially for national governments?
I think what we're going to see, and this is something that I would say again, it's an aspect of the space economy that isn't really talked about. But when we look at private space activity, my first question is, so there are private companies providing space services. Who's the customer? And at the minute, the customer is still very much national space agencies, funding councils, defense contractors. The state is still by far the biggest funder. If you take the state out of it, these private companies, their development will shrink dramatically. So I think the first aspect is who's the customer, and it's still the state. So there is a lot of state funding going into space. It's just being channeled through the private sector rather than big behemoth space agencies doing everything. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is when we get business to business, when we get private space activities in the truest sense, then I think we can really seriously talk about a private space economy. So I think there's that dimension as well, which we need to keep in mind. The customer is still very much the state, defense obviously, and as I say, grant funding and national space agencies.
Let's talk a little bit about India. It's had some success recently, landed the Chandrayaan-3 mission safely on the moon's unexplored South Pole. How has India managed to throw its hat in the ring of this space race? I know you don't want to use the word race, but I'm going to.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting with India. I think India is carving a unique. It's very difficult to carve a unique position for yourself in the current space architecture, given the position, given the real dominant position of America, given the amounts of money that China's putting into it as well. And also, I will mention, I exclude it, and I shouldn't exclude it, because the European Space Agency is a huge player in outer space. Very focused on civil, very focused on what space benefits can be brought to Earth, very much focused on exploration. But nonetheless, the European Space Agency is still a huge player in outer space activities. But looking at India, they've managed to carve themselves a real unique position of the value for money proposition, taking technology, squeezing every last bit of value out of their mission that they can. The Chandrayaan mission was an absolute triumph because it didn't try to do too much. It was focused on a very specific goal. It used components and it used, materials and it used technology that was available, and it produced a realistic and reliable mission. And that's something that I think India is looking to position itself as the provider of the best value for money space activity that there is. And I think that's a great way to actually start thinking about where is the new space activity going to occur.
And are we seeing some of those similar trends we're seeing in sort of the US and China with private companies being key to this effort?
Yes, I think very much India has a huge growth of space startups. So I think that's an area that I think they've identified. They've got a national space policy that really looks to develop that. They've put in place some new institutions to really turbocharge their commercial sector, and I think that's going to be an interesting area to keep an eye on. What I will also say is, of course, as with everything in terms of India, it's always useful to keep an eye on the regional context, keep an eye on what activity they're doing. You know, look at Pakistan, look at China, look at the developments there, because I think there is a defense angle to India's space activity as well.
Yeah, and I think there's a defense angle, and I think there's a big tech angle here as well. I mean, one of the things under the Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been very key in trying to lure in, particularly American high-tech businesses in semiconductors, in other areas, to ramp up investment in India. He's got Apple to manufacture or assemble more iPhones in India via Foxconn, and so there is a broader tech push from the Indian government, which is fascinating as well. Chris, I just want to talk about and move on to the rules of space. The rules of space, and we've spoken about this before, the Artemis Accords. Perhaps some of our listeners haven't heard about it, but this is a NASA-led effort to create some sort of rules in space. Can you just help us understand what they are and their purpose?
So it's really interesting when we talk about rules for space activity. If we go back to the space race, back to 1960s, when Apollo was looking to get to the moon, it was looking to beat Russia to the moon. There, no argument about that. And it was very much in international rules were very much in flavor. The United Nations was the chosen forum for making treaties and making headway on this. So we have the big international treaty, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which lays down a series of core principles that all countries, I say all countries, I think 112, 113 countries are party to the Outer Space Treaty. So a large portion of the world is signed up to this, and it provides a series of principles. It says, each state is free to use space, explore space, and engage in scientific investigation, but it creates this area, this res communis area, where it says there's be no sovereignty, no claims of sovereignty, no claims of ownership. So it then goes on to say that there shouldn't be nuclear weapons stationed in outer space, very much a creature of its time. The 1960s, it was very much a time of looking to restrict the growth of arms control and restrict nuclear weapons. And then it places state responsibility for authorization and control space activities. So we have this treaty that's the central trunk of space law. We then have nations that make their own rules and regulations in the form of statutes. So the UK, for example, has the Space Industry Act, which deals with how we provision of spaceports, range safety, the actual management of a launch, launching and operating. So there's national legislation which puts in place these rules as well. But I think what we're talking about, and I think what you're alluding to in terms of rules, is how do we what are the rules of the game in outer space? How do we decide which satellite moves if there's a collision? How do we decide how to deal with space debris? I think there are a number of areas where there are these rules, and I think there are a number of areas where the rules don't exist. So, for example, if we're thinking in terms of telecommunication and the use of the RF spectrum, that's pretty well regulated. The International Telecommunications Union, they've got a pretty tight handle on that to avoid interference, to make sure that spectrum's managed equitably. That's pretty well sort of managed. I will say the use of spectrum and the use of the RF spectrum is going to be an increasing area of pressure going forward internationally because there's only so much spectrum that can be used, and space is very hungry for spectrum. Especially military activities, it's quite hungry. So I think spectrum's something to keep an eye on. But in terms of the other rules, in terms of how we actually do business in space, that you talk about the Artemis Accords, they are an attempt to politically persuade, they're an attempt to guide states as to how we do business on the moon. So I think there is, and I hate using space puns. It's one of the things that really, really irritates me, but I'm going to use a space pun. There's a vacuum here, and there is a need for nations to come together and to decide this. And I think it's one of those things because of the geopolitics we're in right now, because China, the US are seen as geopolitical adversaries. We haven't even talked about Russia yet and the Russian position. They were a massive space power. I think their space influence is waning a little bit, but still geopolitical adversaries. It's very difficult to get these people around the table to agree to anything. And so that's kind of the problem we've got at the minute. The established institutions, such as the ITU, such as the Commission on Disarmament, such as the United Nations Committee on Peaceful Uses, they're all still in existence. But I think generating new institutions and generating new rulemaking, that's where the difficulty comes.
Let's talk about Russia then. Along with China, they haven't signed up to the Artemis Accords. Would you say they're trying to create an alternative order to the US?
There is the ILRS, the International Lunar Research Station, which has been pushed forward by China as, essentially as an alternative to Project Artemis. It's got a number of signatories to it as well. It will doubtless have its own code of conduct. It will doubtless have its own rules for, lunar activity as well. And I think what we are seeing is some fragmentation. I think, the Artemis Accords represent a specific group of like-minded nations, and I think the ILRS represent another group of like-minded nations. So I think we're seeing a little bit of fragmentation. Again, I think it really depends on what happens when they get there. That's the first thing. We're talking about it in very much in abstract terms here, especially lunar activity. The Project Artemis is they're looking to land on the moon, put humans on the moon by the end of 2026. I will be astonished if they do that. I think that's going to push a little bit further on. China, on the other hand, very careful, steady project that looks at humans on the moon by the end. They kept it very vague, but the end of the 2020s, we'll see something. So I think it's more about getting there right than getting there first now. I think that's the thing that nations need to concentrate on.
And I guess if you think about it, there needs to be some sort of rules. If I'm, one country and I'm saying, well, I'm going to put some sort of space station on the moon, and this is my area, and then, another country came in and tried to encroach on that area. There's all those kind of things, right? I know it seems quite rudimentary, but there is almost these, lines that need to be drawn on the moon to some extent, as one example, and whatever planets we manage to get to next.
I think with the lunar exploration programs that are in place, I think we've got the Outer Space Treaty, and that gives us some indication of the basics, that there can't be any claims of ownership. You can't land on a section of the moon and say, this is mine. You've got to, it's got to be usage, and that's about it. But I think beyond that, I think we've got an attempt with the Artemis Accords to do that, to operationalize the Outer Space Treaty in the context of lunar exploration. I'm sure ILRS will similarly try and codify that as well. So I think what we're going to see is over the next few years, and certainly over the next decade, we'll have a better picture of how these rules need to evolve and what type of rules we're talking about. Are we talking about guidelines that suggest behaviors? Are we talking about rules that enforce behaviors? And if you're trying to enforce behavior, again, we look at the geopolitical situation. Enforcement's really, really difficult. So there's a number of key problems we've got with trying to set up a rules-based system that is based on enforcement. I think at the minute, the best we've got is what we see with the Artemis Accords, these political declarations that say we as states are going to behave in this certain way.
You mentioned fragmentation, and when it comes to the fragmentation of the rules and major space players following different sets of rules, does that increase the chances of conflict? I mean, how likely is it for there to be conflict between these superpowers?
I always think, and I'm not alone in this, the sort of the great space power theorist Blethyn Bowen sort of has talked about this as well, that if we think about orbital Earth as a coastline, and if we think about the way that the powers sort of tend to work, it will always be a manifestation of terrestrial conflict. The idea of a space war, I think, is not something that we're going to see. But what we are going to see is terrestrial conflict that spills over into outer space. So I think the danger there is when conflict on Earth looks like it's escalating, when attention turns to assets in space as being enablers of military capability, then I think we get the danger, rather than the simple problem of being out there. I think the danger is much more pronounced on Earth.
Right, Chris, we're talking about the rules, and you mentioned in the rules space debris. This is a huge issue. The European Space Agency estimates more than 28,000 objects remain in orbit in space. NASA says that most space junk is moving very fast. It can reach speeds of 18,000 miles per hour. How fast even? How fast? I drive at 30 miles an hour on the almost 7 times faster than a bullet. And obviously the problem with this is that these pieces of space junk debris can collide with other objects, which could include a spacecraft that has a crewed mission, which could include other satellites, which could take out communications. This is a huge issue. It has been for a while. Has there been any solutions to solve this? I've heard of these companies trying to create sort of these arms that grab debris out of space and things like that. It's a huge issue.
There's a whole range of solutions out there. There's a whole range of companies out there. There's a company called Astroscale, really well developed in their in solving the problems of trying to get space debris from Earth's orbit and try and make it safe. And the problem comes with it's very expensive. So who's going to pay for it? And this is the thing. This is, again, one of those issues where there are private companies that have solutions, but private companies won't paying for it. So who's going to end up paying for it? Well, when the cost is so high, it can only be the states. It can only be the governments. And so, again, we're back to the question that you asked right at the top. All this expense, all this money that we're spending on space, where we could be spending it on, hospitals and education and domestic infrastructure. There are so many calls on the governmental purse that, space debris management, although I think it's really important, politicians and the people doing the spending, they've got a whole range of constituents asking for money on a whole range of issues. So it gets pushed down. So that's your problem. The problem is who pays?
Can I use a sort of littering analogy, right? Like if you're in, the city and you litter, there might be fines. For example, you throw your rubbish on the floor, there might be fines. If you launch a satellite or some sort of spacecraft, and that spacecraft, explodes or fails and shatters into thousands of pieces, are there the same rules?
But also, how could you even start from identifying that piece of litter, that piece of spacecraft was from this rock? If it's traveling, as you say, 18,000 miles an hour, it's.
There's tracking capabilities that can trace debris. I mean, you can follow where the explosions happened, and you can sort of follow the debris path. Identification isn't, it's obviously it's a problem for real old legacy debris, but for something that happens relatively recently, the debris path can be followed. The problem is with litter. Litter's a great example. Okay, I drop litter and I don't pick it up. What's going to happen to me? A policeman or a police officer or a council official or whatever is going to come and say, pick that up. I'm saying, no, I'm not picking it up. They're going to then fine me, and they're going to. Who's going to fine China? Who's going to fine the United States? And what happens if they do find China or the United States, and the United States just, or China shrugs their shoulders and says, no, we're not paying that. And that's the problem you've got. The problem essentially, and it's the same with all of these rules, is the international legal system is a horizontal system. Each state is sovereign. It relies on consensus, it relies on agreement, it relies on states being agreed to be bound by a series of rules. And states tend to be bound until they don't want to be bound, and then they don't have to be. So it's not like me. It's not like me dropping litter, because there is a regime above me. There is a whole, raft of infrastructure that can make sure I comply. Because if I don't comply, ultimately I can lose my freedom. Ultimately, in certain jurisdictions, I can lose my life. Though it would be a bit mean to shoot me for dropping litter.
What a way to finish. Chris, just quickly, favourite space film before we get to start of the week?
I can't give you just one. There's loads.
What about most realistic space film?
Apollo 13's pretty good, and there was one on Salyut 7 as well, a Russian one, about the Salyut space station. Very similar type of thing. The space station was underpowered and they had to fix it. A really, really good one. But yeah, Apollo 13 for realism, for the amount of effort that they put in, absolutely fantastic. Salyut 7 really well worth watching. And for sheer entertainment, 2010 is the sequel to 2001. Often goes under the radar, but highly recommended.
There you go.
Star Wars is quite realistic.
Oh, for goodness sake. So mine would be Gravity, on the subject of space debris. Gravity I really enjoyed. And obviously they have that incredible scene where the space debris is flying around, and I don't know how realistic that is. Though.
It was very spectacular.
It's rubbish.
I know a lot of people involved in the space industry who look slightly askance at it, but it doesn't matter because it's meant to entertain.
And it entertained me, and that's the most important thing. Brilliant. Chris, let's play Stat of the Week before we let you go. So, Arjun, over to you.
100,000 years.
100,000 years. So, Chris, as the guest, you can decide whether to go first or second.
I'll go second.
Every time the guest wants to go, so it makes sense. Okay, 100,000 years, the time it takes to travel to the sun.
I'm going to go with travel, but not to the sun. I'm going to say that it is, and let's have a think. Yeah, the time it would take an ordinary spacecraft to travel on a round trip to every planet in the solar system.
Oh, so you're both right on the travel aspect. But the specific details are apparently, anyways, this is what I read on a BBC teaching website. At the speed of light, it'd take 100,000 years to travel across the Milky Way, which is apparently, and I think I've got this right, 621 quadrillion miles wide.
Quadrillion?
Yeah, quadrillion. I've never used a quadrillion on.
That is
on
a 6 with a whole page of notes with it.
Yeah. But it's massive. And apparently, the speed of light take 100,000 years to travel across the Milky Way.
Well, there you go. Chris, did you learn something today?
Always.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on Beyond the Valley. That's it for this episode. Before we go, please follow and subscribe to the show. And you can even leave us a review. And if you want to contact Arjun and I or have a question about a past episode, then email us at beyondthevalley@cnbc.com. Thank you so much, Chris.
No problem at all. Lovely to be with you.
Thank you, Arjun.
Thank you, Tom.
We'll be back for another episode of Beyond the Valley. Goodbye.
Beyond the Valley.